Welcome to another deep dive into UN peace operations. Today, we're going to zero in on Haiti. You know, a country that's had this, I don't know, almost like this, entangled relationship with the UN for decades now. We're going to be using Mobek's book. It's called UN Peace Operations, Lessons from Haiti, 1994-2016. Really dives into what the UN was trying to do there, what worked, what didn't work, and why it all matters going forward for future missions.
You know, I think one of the things that's, I guess, really fascinating about Haiti is that it really offers this almost kind of unparalleled case study when it comes to the UN. I mean, think about it. They've had a presence there pretty much constantly since 1994 through 7 distinct missions. I mean, that's a lot of time to, test different approaches and to learn some pretty hard lessons.
7 missions. Yeah, I was struck by that, too, when I was reading the book. It's not your typical, I don't know, like post-war scenario.
No, exactly. It's more this kind of ongoing turbulent transition, which really raises some tough questions about how those traditional peacekeeping models, how they hold up in a place that's constantly kind of petering on the edge.
So before we even get to the UN's involvement, Mobekk really makes a strong case in the book for understanding Haiti's own history. Like, you can't really disentangle the present from the past.
Yeah, absolutely. She goes all the way back to the French colonial period, which, was brutal, to say the least. And one detail that really stuck with me was, the French didn't just exploit Haiti economically, but they created this really rigid social hierarchy based on race and origin.
Right.
You had the white colonists at the top, free people of color in the middle, and then enslaved Africans at the bottom. And you can see how that legacy, even after independence in 1804, continued to fuel the instability that the UN was trying to fix centuries later.
It's like those divisions were just kind of baked into the very fabric of Haitian society. And then, of course, you have the American occupation in the early 20th century, which wasn't exactly a benevolent period either, as Mobekk points out.
No, not at all. I mean, the U.S. had their own agenda.
Yeah.
And, one of their lasting legacies was the establishment of the gendarmerie, which later became the Haitian army. And their intention was to create stability. But it actually really backfired. The army became highly politicized, and it was often a source of instability rather than a solution to it.
Talk about unintended consequences. And then, of course, you can't forget about the Duvaliers, father and son, ruling with an iron fist for almost 3 decades.
Right. The Duvalier regimes were absolutely brutal. I mean, corruption was rampant. Human rights abuses were systematic. They used violence to silence any opposition. And this created this climate of fear and distrust that persisted long after they were gone.
So you have this backdrop of colonialism, foreign intervention, and dictatorship. So it's no wonder that when the UN arrives in 1994, they're stepping into a situation that's
extra volatile.
Incredibly volatile.
Exactly. And Mobekk argues that you can't just kind of parachute into a place like Haiti and expect to fix things, without understanding those deep-rooted issues. It's not just about addressing the immediate problems. It's about grappling with these historical legacies that continue to shape the present.
It's like trying to build a house on a foundation that's already cracked. Speaking of cracks, let's dive into, I think, one of the biggest challenges the UN faced in Haiti, which is the issue of security.
One of the,
I think,
most fascinating insights from the book is how Mobekk breaks down security in Haiti. She differentiates between political violence, criminal activity, and gang violence. And so the UN had to deal with all 3 of these, which made, creating a stable environment incredibly difficult.
I think some listeners might be thinking, well, wasn't the UN's whole point to bring security? But it seems like they were constantly playing catch-up, especially in Port-au-Prince, which was a hotbed of gang activity.
Yeah, and you're hitting on, I think, a key point here. The book reveals that the UN's approach to security in Haiti actually evolved over time. So initially, they were focused on, traditional peacekeeping. So monitoring ceasefires, separating armed groups, that kind of thing. But that quickly proved inadequate in a place like Haiti.
So what did they do?
Well, they had to shift.
Sure.
Towards a more robust form of peacekeeping, which involved,
Yeah.
Directly engaging with armed groups and using force to try to restore order.
That sounds like a major departure from the traditional peacekeeping model. Did that even work?
That's a good question, and one that I think Mobekk explores in depth. So the shift to this more robust peacekeeping. It brought its own set of challenges. It raised questions about the use of force, kind of the blurring lines between peacekeeping and counterinsurgency, the potential for mission creep. But I think the bigger problem was that even with this more assertive approach, security remained really elusive in Haiti.
That makes me think about, another key theme that emerges from the book, which is disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. or DDR as it's often called. And I'm guessing this wasn't exactly a walk in the park in Haiti either.
No, not at all. And here's where the historical context comes back into play.
Yeah.
You know, traditional DDR models often rely on there being kind of clear warring factions and a peace agreement to guide the process. But Haiti didn't really fit that mold. I mean, there were no clear lines between political actors, armed gangs, criminal elements. It was a very messy and constantly shifting landscape.
So how did the UN try to apply DDR in such a complex environment?
Yeah, that's where it gets, I think, really interesting, and where Mobekk's analysis gets, I think, super insightful. So the book reveals that applying this kind of cookie-cutter DDR model in Haiti was doomed from the start. So the initial efforts focused very heavily on disarmament, so collecting weapons. But that proved incredibly difficult. Armed gangs, often enjoyed protection from powerful political actors. And there was, I think, a real lack of trust in the UN's motives.
It sounds like the UN was trying to impose a solution from the outside, rather than working with local communities to find one that fit their context.
Yeah, you're spot on. And the book repeatedly emphasizes, I think, this tension between international intervention and local ownership. And it wasn't just about disarmament. The initial DDR efforts also failed to adequately address reintegration. So the process of, helping former combatants transition back into civilian life.
So even if they managed to disarm some people, there was no plan for what happened next?
Essentially, yes. There was a lack of government support. Economic opportunities were really scarce. And the programs were often seen as, rewarding perpetrators without addressing the issue of justice for past abuse. So it's no wonder that reintegration efforts largely failed.
We're starting to see a pattern here. The UN comes in with this set of tools and approaches that may have worked elsewhere, but they're trying to apply them in a place that's incredibly complex and where the past kind of keeps influencing the present.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a crucial takeaway from this deep dive. Understanding the context, both historical and contemporary, is really essential for any successful intervention. And it's a lesson that's relevant, I think, not just for Haiti, but for UN peace operations everywhere. This idea of the UN bringing this toolkit that doesn't quite fit, it keeps coming up as we dig deeper into the book.
It does, doesn't it? It's like they were trying to force a square peg into a round hole. And it becomes even more apparent, I think, when we look at their efforts to reform the Haitian National Police, the PNH.
Yeah, Mobekk really lays out the ambition of this project. The UN, along with other international partners, wanted to create this professional, accountable police force, practically from scratch, a force that could uphold the rule of law and protect the rights of all Haitians.
Sounds like a Herculean task, especially given everything we've already talked about. The corruption, the lack of resources, the deep-seated distrust in authority.
It was a monumental undertaking. And remember, the Haitian army, which had basically functioned as the police for much of the country's history, had been disbanded. So the PNH was this brand new institution. And the UN was essentially trying to build it on a foundation that was, well, incredibly shaky.
So where did they even begin? Did they just start handing out badges and hoping for the best?
Not quite. There was a huge emphasis on training. The UN poured resources into training Haitian police officers, not just on the practical aspects of law enforcement, but also on human rights, community policing, building trust with the public.
Sounds like they were trying to instill a completely new ethos in the PNH, a far cry from the often brutal reputation of the Haitian army.
That was the goal. But as you might expect, the reality was far more complicated. So for starters, resources were a constant issue. Equipping and training a new police force is incredibly expensive, and the UN missions were often underfunded. The book describes instances where the PNH lacked basic equipment, vehicles, even proper uniforms at times.
I can't imagine that did much for morale, let alone their ability to actually do their jobs effectively.
Exactly. And then there was the controversy surrounding the training itself. Initially, much of it was conducted on U.S. military bases, which didn't sit well with many Haitians. It brought back memories of past interventions and fueled perceptions of the PNH as being a tool of foreign influence, rather than a truly Haitian institution.
So the optics were terrible, even if the intentions were good.
Yeah, it was a PR disaster, really. And that, of course, there was the whole issue of human rights abuses. Despite all the emphasis on human rights training, there were still reports of PNH officers using excessive force, engaging in corruption, and even extrajudicial killings. It made you question whether the training was actually sinking in.
It's disheartening to hear that, especially given all the effort and resources that went into reforming the police. What does Mobekk say about why those efforts fell short?
She points to a few key factors. One is that the training itself, while well-intentioned, may not have been sufficient to overcome. Deeply ingrained cultural norms. Remember we talked about how Haiti's history had created this association between weapons, uniforms, and power. It was a mindset that wasn't going to change overnight, no matter how many human rights workshops you held.
It's almost like they were treating the symptoms without addressing the underlying disease.
That's a great analogy. And the other issue that Mobekk highlights is the lack of a functioning justice system. Without a system that could hold police officers accountable for their actions, there was this pervasive sense of impunity. And it created this vicious cycle where abuses could occur without consequence, which further eroded public trust in the P&H.
Sounds like police reform was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. You can't fix one part without addressing the whole system.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial area that the UN sought to reform, the Haitian justice system. It's a theme that really resonated with me because I think it gets to the heart of what it means to build a just and equitable society.
Okay, let's talk about the justice system. Because from what we've learned so far, I'm not expecting a growing rapport.
You're right to be skeptical. At the time of the UN interventions, the Haitian justice system was, to put it mildly, a mess. Corruption was rampant, judges were often bribed or intimidated, and the judiciary lacked independence. Justice was often for sale, and those without money or connections had little chance of receiving a fair trial.
It sounds like a system designed to protect the powerful and punish the vulnerable.
It was a system that had failed generations of Haitians. And beyond the corruption, there were practical challenges as well. Courts were underfunded, understaffed, and lacked basic resources. This resulted in huge backlogs of cases, sometimes stretching on for years. Imagine waiting years just to have your case heard, knowing that the outcome might be predetermined by who you knew or how much money you pay.
It's hard to imagine a system that's more broken and demoralizing.
Yeah, it was a system that had lost all credibility. And then there were the prisons, overcrowded, unsanitary, dangerous places, lacking basic necessities like food, water, and medical care. It was a bleak picture all around.
So facing this seemingly insurmountable challenge, what did the UN actually try to do to fix the justice system? Did they have any successes?
Well, they poured resources into training judges and lawyers, trying to instill a sense of professionalism and ethics. They also worked on legal reforms, trying to create a framework that was more just and equitable. And they invested in improving prison conditions, though, as you can imagine, progress on that front was incredibly slow and difficult.
Sounds like they were throwing everything but the kitchen sink at the problem. But were those efforts enough to overcome the deep-seated issues we've been discussing?
That's the big question, isn't it? And unfortunately, the answer is not really. Despite some localized successes and improvements, the same fundamental problems kept resurfacing: the lack of resources, the political interference, the culture of impunity. These were all deeply entrenched obstacles that proved incredibly difficult to overcome.
It's almost as if they were trying to change the tires on a car that was still speeding down the highway.
That's a great way to put it. And it highlights, I think, a key takeaway from the book. Reforming a justice system is not just about technical fixes or training programs. It's about addressing the underlying social, political, and economic conditions that created the problems in the first place. It's about changing mindsets, building trust, and creating a system that truly serves the people.
Sounds like the UN may have underestimated just how difficult that task would be in a place like Haiti.
I think that's fair to say. And it's a cautionary tale, I think, for any intervention that seeks to impose change from the outside without truly understanding the context and working in genuine partnership with local communities.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the UN's ultimate goal in Haiti. Democratization, after all. This was the first time a UN mission was explicitly tasked with promoting democracy.
It is a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
The UN trying to foster democracy in a country with such a long history of authoritarianism.
So how do they even approach that?
Well, the book describes a multi-pronged approach. They supported free and fair elections, helping with things like voter registration and deploying international observers. They also worked to strengthen governance institutions like the parliament, the judiciary, the civil service, all the essential components of a functioning democracy. And they tried to foster civil society participation, supporting a wide range of organizations and encouraging them to hold the government accountable.
Sounds like a textbook definition of democracy promotion.
It does. But as you might have guessed by now, the reality on the ground was far messier.
Okay, so let's break down each of those efforts, starting with elections. How did the UN try to ensure that they were actually free and fair? Did they succeed?
Well, they provided technical assistance, helped register voters, and deployed those international observers we talked about. But from the beginning, there were challenges. Political violence and intimidation were widespread, which skewed the playing field. There were also allegations of fraud and irregularities, which further eroded public trust in the process.
So even with the UN's involvement, the elections were still deeply flawed. Seems like a recurring theme. The UN's good intentions colliding with the harsh realities of Haitian politics.
It's a pattern that emerges again and again, and beyond elections. There are efforts to strengthen those governance institutions. The parliament, the judiciary, the civil service also faced major hurdles. These institutions were weak, under-resourced, and often riddled with corruption. It was like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand.
And what about their efforts to engage civil society? Did they manage to empower Haitian citizens to participate in the democratic process?
They did make some headway there. They supported a range of civil society organizations, provided training and funding, and encouraged them to hold the government accountable. But civil society in Haiti faced its own set of challenges. They were often repressed, lacked resources, and were divided along political lines. So while they played a role, they weren't always in a strong position to challenge the status quo or drive meaningful change.
It sounds like the UN was trying to plant a garden in soil that was still poisoned by the legacy of authoritarianism.
That's a powerful image, and it highlights, I think, the long-term nature of democratization. It's not something that can be imposed from the outside or achieved overnight. It requires a fundamental shift in attitudes, behaviors, and institutions. And that takes time, resources, and a sustained commitment from all stakeholders.
So even with the UN's best efforts, democracy remained elusive in Haiti.
That's the difficult truth. There were moments of progress, periods of relative stability and democratic governance. They had several elections, some of which were deemed relatively free and fair, but those gains were often fragile and easily reversed. Ultimately, I think the UN's efforts to promote democracy were hampered by those same underlying factors we've been talking about: the lack of resources, the political interference, the enduring legacy of authoritarianism, and the deep social and economic divisions that continue to fracture Haitian society.
It's almost as if history was working against them every step of the way.
I think that's a fair assessment. And it underscores, I think, the complexity of peace building and the need for humility in approaching these kinds of interventions. But despite the setbacks, there are still valuable lessons to be learned from the UN's experience in Haiti.
Feels like we've only just skimmed the surface of like a very complex topic. I mean, we've covered security, DDR police reform, the justice system, all within this broader goal of, democratization. And through it all, I think this theme of like the UN's good intentions clashing with the realities on the ground just keeps coming up.
Yeah, I think it's unavoidable, really. Yeah. Mobekk isn't arguing that the UN was, malicious or incompetent, but rather that they often underestimated, I think, the deeply entrenched challenges in Haiti. And crucially, they sometimes struggle to adapt their approaches to fit the specific context.
You mentioned earlier that even with the setbacks, there are valuable lessons to be learned. As we wrap up this deep dive, what stands out to you as like the most crucial takeaway?
I think for me, it's the importance of humility. Recognizing the limitations of external interventions, acknowledging the complexity of peace building, and understanding that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
So a healthy dose of realism is essential. But beyond that, what can the UN and the international community as a whole do differently based on the lessons learned in Haiti?
I think the book really stresses the importance of local ownership. Interventions are far more likely to succeed when they have, genuine buy-in from the people they're meant to help. That means working in true partnership with local communities, empowering local actors, and ensuring that solutions are tailored to the specific context.
So it's not just about what the UN does, but how they do it. Their approach needs to be as sensitive to the local culture and history as it is to the technical aspects of peacekeeping.
Absolutely. And I think along with local ownership, there needs to be this sustained commitment to sustainable development. You can't build lasting peace without addressing the underlying, economic and social inequalities that often fuel conflict.
Yeah, we saw that very clearly in Haiti, how, poverty, lack of opportunity, and those deep-seated social divisions really played a huge role in undermining the UN's efforts.
Exactly. And I think we also need to rethink kind of traditional approaches to security. The book highlights how the UN's initial reliance on, a more traditional peacekeeping model simply wasn't effective in dealing with the complex and fluid security challenges in Haiti. They had to shift towards a more robust approach. But that came with its own set of problems.
It's like they were constantly trying to find the right balance between keeping the peace and actually enforcing it. But then that raises questions about the use of force, the blurring of lines between peacekeeping and counterinsurgency, and the potential for mission creep.
Right. Those are all valid concerns, and ones that I think the international community needs to grapple with, honestly. There are no easy answers, and each situation will require, I think, careful consideration and adaptation.
So what's the path forward? How can we learn from the mistakes made in Haiti to create more effective and sustainable peace operations in the future?
I think one key is to empower civil society. They're often the ones closest to the problems. They understand the local context best, and they have a vested interest in creating lasting solutions. So the UN and other international actors need to do more to support civil society organizations, provide them with resources, and give them a real seat at the table.
It's about recognizing that lasting peace and democracy can't be imposed from the outside. They have to grow organically from within.
Precisely. And it's about shifting away from kind of a mindset of intervention and towards a model of partnership and collaboration.
And on that note, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought from the book. Mobekk argues that despite the challenges and setbacks, the UN's experience in Haiti offers valuable lessons for future peace operations. It's not about dwelling on the failures, but rather about using those experiences to inform and improve our approaches to peace building in a complex and ever-changing world.
Well said. The quest for peace is an ongoing journey, and each mission, each intervention, provides an opportunity to learn and grow.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complexities of UN peace operations in Haiti. It's been an eye-opening journey.
The pleasure was all mine.